Morning, Trinity. I'd like to go today to Romans 12. There's a verse here in Romans 12 that somebody named David Platt brought to mind last night. I was out moving mulch with a wheelbarrow, and I was listening to a podcast. And David Platt is an author and a pastor, more importantly, and actually a pastor kind of in our tribe. He's an SBC pastor. That I've read and appreciated before. He wrote a book called Radical from his experience around the world, thinking about how rich Western Christians should be disciples of Christ in the 21st century, given how much poverty and persecution there is around the world. I respect Platt. I think he's a good pastor. And he wrote this book called Before You Vote, 7 Questions Every Christian Should Ask. And he was on the podcast talking about Before You Vote, and it was timely because we're about to vote. And he pointed us to Romans 12. The book sounds like a good one. I haven't read his book yet, but I listened to the whole interview, and it was insightful. It was some helpful kind of biblical framing around the election. I recommend the interview. I think the book is probably good. You can either listen to that interview, it's about half an hour, or you can read the transcript. I will post a link to both. He has helpful thoughts on how to think through how do we vote as Christians? How do we vote as Christians if we have friends who disagree with us politically and are Christians? How do we vote as Christians if, because it is really important to us to see, for example, less abortion in this country? How do we vote and navigate a political season as Christians? He tells interesting stories. For example, when President Trump office called him 5 minutes before service and said, "Can the president come to your worship service?" Which seems like a simple question, except that he's also a political candidate, and as churches we're not candidating organizations, so he had to make a split-second decision. That was an interesting story. It's really helpful to listen to Platt and how he's worked through this as a pastor, and they've worked through all of this election season as a church. But the verse he mentions that I find very striking is Romans 12:2. Romans 12 is dear to me. I think that when I memorized Romans 12 as a 6th or 7th grader, my volunteer leader, Brian Key, took us to the Mariners game. He either took us to a Mariners game or to his cabin. But I remember memorizing Romans 12 because of that. And yet, through the rest of my life, Romans 12 has been very dear to me. And I'm really grateful that he bribed us to memorize it. But I haven't thought about this verse in terms of politics until now, and I think it's a great verse to be thinking about in terms of politics right now. Romans 12:2 says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." Do not be conformed to this world. A lot of what this world is telling us right now, what the world teaches us to do is to pick a side, and if you're going to be a Democrat, then you need to just lay into Republicans. If you're going to be a Republican, you need to fight tooth and claw with Democrats, and it seems to be a no-holds-barred season, and many would tell us to put all of our attention and all of our hopes toward this election in November. But Romans reminds us, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect.